and welcome back to our podcast. I'm the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
We're continuing on talking about some disturbing or just unusual, we'll say, conspiracy theories. And this week we're going to be discussing the moon landing hoax. Now, this is going to be a long one, so we've actually broken it up into two parts because there's a lot of stuff that is disputed. Now, this conspiracy theory is actually kind of fascinating. If you take the time to listen to both sides of the argument, you can see some seemingly valid points made by both sides, really.
Yeah.
I mean, you can. Now, whether or not you believe it doesn't matter, but you can see their point at the very least. It's not so outlandish that you're just like, what? Like some of them are. So we're going to start by giving you a brief introduction to what the theory basically entails. So the conspiracy theories surrounding this supposed hoax claim that some or all of the elements of the Apollo program and the associated moon landings were hoaxes that were staged by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which also is better known as, of course, NASA. The most notable of these theories state that the 6 crewed landings that took place between 1969 and 1972 were faked, and that the 12 Apollo astronauts did not ever actually land on the moon. Okay. Now, there's some people that believe more along the lines that it was just the first one that was faked because we were in this space race with Russia, the Soviets.
And the only thing that mattered, who was the first one to get there.
Right, and then the other ones were actually real. So there are some that lean that way, and then some, but we're going to be talking about it as in the whole thing was faked. And we've never basically been to the moon, or at that time anyway, you know what I'm saying. So there have been several groups that have made claims since the mid-1970s that NASA, as well as others, knowingly misled the public into believing that the landings had taken place. This was done by manufacturing, tampering with, or destroying evidence, which included photos, telemetry, tapes, radio and TV transmissions, and moon rock samples. So, as expected, there is much evidence to support that the landings actually took place. There have also been several detailed rebuttals against the hoax claims since the late 2000s. There have been high-definition photos taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, that have shown the Apollo landing sites and the tracks that were left by the astronauts. In 2012, images were released showing 5 of the 6 missions' American flags that were erected on the moon, which were still standing. The exception was the Apollo 11 flag, which was seen lying on the moon's surface due to it being blown over by the Lunar Module Ascent Propulsion System. So it was still there, it just got knocked over during one of the other missions or whatever. Still, opinion polls taken between 1994 and 2000 showed that between 6 and 20% of Americans, 25% of Britons, and 28% of Russians believed that the crew landings were fake. There was even a later documentary that claimed that the first landing was faked in 1969, as I said again, so that America could win the space race. So we're going to explore some of the reasons why people believe the original moon landing was a hoax. So originally, as we've already mentioned, the space race. So there was a lot of motivation for the U.S. to engage with the Soviet Union in a space race that can be traced back basically to the Cold War. So we were like big competitors with them. We wanted to be the first to get there it's just prestige, basically.
Right.
So being the first to land on the moon was viewed as a national and a technological accomplishment that would generate worldwide acclaim. Because sure it would. That was something that had never been done before, and that was a big thing, However, getting to the moon was going to be too risky and expensive, which was exemplified by John F. Kennedy's famously stating in a 1962 speech that the United States chose to go to the moon because it was going to be hard. All right. So, hoax theory debunker Phil Platt stated in his 2002 book, Bad Astronomy, that the Soviets, with their own competing moon program, an extensive intelligence network, and a formidable scientific community able to analyze NASA data, would have cried foul if the U.S. tried to fake a moon landing, especially since their own program had failed. And I kind of agree with that. If they had thought it would have been faked, I think they would have flipped. and been like, nope, nope. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But anyway, because they were very people just don't realize how this was going on. This was huge. You know, each one wanted to be the first to get there. And I mean, wanted to. Thus, proving a hoax would have been a huge win for the Soviets. Instead, the third edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia contained many articles that reported the landings as factual. Conspiracist Bart Sibrel responded incorrectly, asserting that the Soviets could not track deep space craft until late into 1972, immediately after which the last 3 Apollo missions were abruptly canceled. However, these missions were canceled not abruptly, but for cost-cutting reasons. And truthfully, the Soviets had been sending uncrewed spacecraft to the moon since 1959, and during 1962, deep space tracking facilities were introduced at IP-15 in Azurisk and IP-16 in Evaporatoria, while Saturn communication stations were added to IP-3, 4, and 14, the last of which had a 100 million kilometer or 62 million mile range. So, yes, they could have tracked it. They had a huge, they could have done something. So, next we're going to talk about another theory as to why this was faked, was for NASA funding and prestige. So, conspiracists basically claimed that NASA faked the landings to avoid humiliation and to ensure that it continued to receive funding. NASA raised approximately $30 billion to go to the moon, which is nothing to, snub your nose at, and that would be even more than Dave's money.
Yep.
So, which was theorized to be used as money to pay off those involved in the hoax so that they would keep their mouths shut. So that's where the money supposedly went. Many conspiracists also argue that sending men to the moon was impossible at the time. This is further described by Mary Bennett and David Percy, who claimed in their 2001 book, Dark Moon, Apollo, and the Whistleblowers, that given all the known unknown hazards with sending a man to the moon, NASA would not have risked broadcasting an astronaut who could have possibly gotten sick or died on live TV. So they're saying it was faked, so they wouldn't have risked actually showing live footage. Well, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
They really wanted to, show it so you can see that side too. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So another thing that we hear about a lot is the whole distraction thing, right? There's something going on, so they get something else going on to distract us, right? So some people theorize that this was a distraction from the Vietnam War. The American Patriots Friends Network claimed in 2009 that the landings helped the U.S. government distract public attention away from the highly unpopular Vietnam War, which is why the crewed landings abruptly ended around the same time that the U.S. ended its involvement in the war. Now, this is refuted by claiming that the final planned flights were cut due to budget issues and because the NASA budget had fell by 42% by 1972 when they ended, so they didn't have the money to keep it going on. Now, is that true? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? You can see both sides because the government is known to use distraction. They are. We've seen it before.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some hoax claims and the rebuttals around them. So, according to many, the conspiracy theories are impossible due to their size and complexity. The conspiracy would need to include approximately 400,000 people, and this would include all the people who had worked on the Apollo project for around 10 years, the 12 men who had walked on the moon, the 6 others who flew with them as command module pilots, another 6 astronauts who had orbited the moon, all the people, who had helped build the, everything, everybody involved. It'd be a huge number of people.
Yeah, it would be.
So it'd be basically what they're saying is it would be very hard to keep all those people quiet.
Yeah, I could see that.
That would be very difficult to do. So this would mean hundreds of thousands of people would need to keep the secret. It's theorized that it would be easier to actually complete the mission than to try to create the hoax. And I can see that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next thing a lot of people point out is photographic and film oddities. Now, we've all heard about these things, so we're going to talk about some of those. or several of them, actually. So many conspiracists focus heavily on photos. They point out oddities in both the photos and films that were claimed to have been taken on the moon. Photography experts, including those who are unrelated to NASA, have stated that the oddities are consistent in what would be expected from an actual moon landing and are not consistent with manipulated or studio imagery. So people who are not involved with NASA have looked at them and said that they look authentic. So one of the things that people point out is in that some photos, apparently the crosshairs appear to be behind objects, which, shouldn't be the case, right? Because the crosshairs should be over the top of it. So the cameras were fitted with this clear glass plate with a reticle etched on it, which is that little crosshair thing or whatever, known as a Réseau plate, which would make it impossible for any photograph image to appear in front of that grid or that crosshair image. Conspiracists claim that this proves that the objects were pasted over the photos. Now, rebuttals claim that this effect only appears in copied or scanned photos and not on any of the originals, and it's said to be caused by overexposure where the bright white areas of the emulsion bleed over the black crosshairs, which, could be very true. I mean, we don't know what photos they're looking at. I highly doubt they're looking at the original photos. You know what I'm saying?
Probably not.
You get what I'm saying? They're probably looking at copies, and God knows where they got them from, and who knows? And these were like from 1960, so you can just imagine what the quality would have been, anyway, even with top-notch stuff. Other claims state that the crosshairs are sometimes rotated in the wrong place. Now, rebuttals of this claim are that it's a result of the popular photo being cropped or rotated for an aesthetic impact, like for, a magazine or something. They may crop it, move it, do that. They're doing it, in other words. It's not what was on the original photo. They're causing it. And I can see that, too, because, if you're putting it in a magazine or, something like that or some sort of website, you would want it to look as best as possible. So some claim that the quality of the photos is implausibly high. This is rebutted by claiming that there are many poor quality photos that were taken by Apollo astronauts and that NASA only chose to publish the best photos. The astronauts were also said to have used high-resolution Hasselblad 500 EL cameras with Carl Zeiss optics in a 70mm medium format film magazine. Now, another oddity is that there are no stars in any of the photos. Like around the moon, you can't see any stars. You think out in space, you would see stars, right?
Absolutely.
So, however, Apollo 11 astronauts stated in post-mission press conferences that they didn't remember even seeing any stars either when they were on there during their extravehicular activity. In other words, when they were out walking around or in the rover, blah, 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 they didn't even really see any either. Conspiracists contend that NASA chose not to put the stars in the photo because astronomers would have been able to use them to determine whether they were taken on the Earth or the Moon by the position of them. Which, I could see that if that were true. So this is rebutted by statements claiming that the stars are rarely seen in space shuttle, Earth observation photos, or even photos taken at sporting events like taken at night. The light from the sun in outer space in the Earth-Moon system is at least as bright as the sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface on a clear day. So, cameras used for imaging subjects illuminated by sunlight are set for a daylight exposure. The dim light of the stars does not provide enough exposure to record visible images. So basically the sun is drowning them out, which would make sense. Also, if you thought about it like that. All crewed landings happened during the lunar daytime, thus the stars were outshone by the sun, and the sunlight reflected off the moon's surfaces, which, would have been bright too. So that was just washing it out, basically.
Yep.
Which I could see that as being that too. But then, you hear that, you're thinking, well, you still would think, I don't know. I've never been in outer space. So, also, the astronauts' eyes were adapted to the sunlit landscape around them, so they could not see the relatively faint starlight, meaning the astronauts would have only been able to see the starlight with their naked eye if they were on the dark side of the moon. So basically, their eyes were adapted to being out in daylight, so it had been hard to see things out in the darkness. They were only able to see the bright light around them, basically, which makes sense as well. It's like if you're in a room and somebody's outside and they're in the dark, you can't really see them, but they can see in.
Yeah.
Sort of same basic difference. Your eyes are adjusted to the light. Another claim is that the angle and color of the shadows are inconsistent, which points to the use of artificial light. Now, the rebuttal of these claims is that shadows on the moon are complicated by reflected light, uneven ground, wide-angle lens distortion, and lunar dust. Is that true? Who knows? Another claim is that there are identical backgrounds in photos that were claimed to have been taken miles apart, which would point to a painted background being used instead of them actually moving around to different areas. Now, this is refuted by claims that the backgrounds were not identical, just similar. For example, what appears as nearby hills in some photos are actually mountains, which are many miles away. On Earth, objects that are further away will appear fainter and less detailed. On the moon, however, there's no atmosphere or haze to obscure faraway objects, thus they appear, clearer and nearer than they are. So what looked like hills were actually mountains and things like that, but they were further away, but you know what I'm saying? They were clear, so it made them really look like they were hills. Also, there are a few objects such as trees around to help judge distance, so you know what I'm saying. It's kind of hard to say, where they were. Another claim states that the number of photos taken is implausibly high, with up to one photo being taken per 50 seconds. Now, this is refuted by stating that the simplified gear with fixed settings allowed 2 photos a second. Many were taken immediately after each other as stereo pairs and panorama sequences. Also, the calculation was based on there only being one astronaut present on the moon's surface when there were actually 2. So there would have been more photos taken because they were both taking pictures, not just one person. Another claim pointed out photos contained artifacts such as 2 seemingly matching C's on a rock, and on the ground there claimed to be like things that looked like it was just labeled in different things, and they're saying that looks like studio props. They were labeled as studio props, and that's why they had them on there. Now, this is rebutted by claiming that the C-shaped objects are just most likely printing imperfections and do not appear in the original film from the camera. It's also been suggested that the C was actually just a coiled hair that got on one of the photos or something, which is also possible.
It's possible.
So, the 1994 book Moonshot contained an obviously fake composite photo of Alan Shepard hitting a golf ball on the moon with another astronaut. Now, this is rebutted by stating that this photo was used for the book because the existing real images were from a TV monitor and were too grainy to be used. So, it was not meant to be real, and when they put it out, they knew it wasn't real. They just made it look better, basically. Now, there are claims that there appear to be hot spots in some photos, which look as though a large spotlight was used to replicate the sun. Now, this is refuted by claims that the pits on the moon's surface focus and reflect light like the tiny glass spheres used in the coating of street signs or dewdrops on wet grass. And this is said to create a glow around the photographer's own shadow when it appears in a photograph. Which could be true. I don't know. Like I said, I've never been in space. I've never been on the moon. I don't know what would happen if you were. So also, if the astronaut is standing in the sunlight while photographing into the shade, the light reflected off his white spacesuit also yields a similar effect to a spotlight. So the light's shining off that white spacesuit and it's kind of gleaming out like a light too. Also, others also file Neil Armstrong stepping out onto the moon's surface. Now, they said that this was not they were like, he didn't do it, blah, blah, blah. This was because who filmed it, basically, when he came out. Like, how could it be filmed? Nobody else was out there. He was supposed to be the first one stepped out, blah, 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 right? So this is refuted by claims that the cameras on the lunar module is the one who filmed it. The Apollo TV camera was mounted in the Modularized Equipment Storage Assembly, or MESA, the Apollo lunar module, and it gave a great view of the exterior of the craft. So Neil was able to basically kind of open the door and deploy this from the side of the module before he stepped down, and the camera was then turned on and a signal was transmitted back to Earth, and which allowed upwards of 600 million people to watch the feed when he actually stepped out, which makes sense too.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, but anyway, people still argue, that couldn't be possible, which I don't know how they argue some of the stuff they argue. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It's not for us to discuss that. So next, we're going to discuss the environmental factors that they said would have been a theory, a reason why it couldn't have happened. So conspiracy theorists claim that the astronauts would not have been able to survive the trip to the moon because of the radiation exposure that they would have sustained from the Van Allen radiation belt and the galactic ambient radiation. Now, other theorists also claim that Starfish Prime, which was his high-altitude nuclear test that took place in 1962, also formed another intense layer of the Van Allen belt. Now, this has never been proven. This is just what they're claiming. But anyway, for those who are wondering what the Van Allen radiation belt is, it's basically a zone of energetic charged particles, most of which originate from solar wind, that are captured and held around a planet. Okay? So the rebuttal to this point points out that there are two main Van Allen belts, the inner belt and the outer belt, and there's also this third sort of transient belt. Now, the inner belt is the most dangerous, and it contains energetic protons. However, the outer belt is less dangerous, and it has more of these low energy electrons that are known as beta particles. The Apollo spacecraft was supposed to have passed through the inner belt in just a matter of minutes. So the most dangerous part, it went through it in just a couple of minutes. And it passed through the outer belt in approximately 1.5 hours. Now, the astronauts were also shielded from ionizing radiation by the aluminum hulls of their spacecraft. Also, the orbital transfer trajectory from the Earth to the Moon was chosen to lessen their exposure to radiation. So they mapped it out to where they would go through it to where they wouldn't get as much anyway. Even James Van Allen, the discoverer of the Van Allen belt, rebuted the claims that the radiation levels were too dangerous for the Apollo mission. So the man who even made the discovery said it wasn't bad enough that it would, kill them or whatever. The total radiation received on the trip was estimated to be about the same as allowed for workers in the nuclear energy field to receive in about a year. So, fair amount, but not a drastic amount. You get what I'm saying? It's not like a Chernobyl type nuclear radiation event or something. You know what I'm saying? So, theorists also claim that the film used in the camera would have been fogged by this radiation. Now, the rebuttal for this claim is that the film was kept in metal containers that were able to stop the radiation from fogging the emulsion. Also, the film was not fogged in lunar probes such as the Lunar Orbiter and the Lunar 3. So, in other words, they'd already sent things up there and it didn't happen because they put them in this metal case. And what went through it didn't damage the film, basically. Now, the next theory claims that the moon's surface during the daytime would have been so hot that the film for the camera would have melted. Now, I don't know how hot it's supposed to. I've never heard any, but whatever. Now, rebuttals of this claim that there is no atmosphere on the moon to efficiently bind the lunar surface heat to devices that are not in direct contact with it. So you're basically in this vacuum and only radiation remains as a heat transfer mechanism. The physics behind radiative heat transfer is thoroughly understood, and the proper use of passive optical coatings and paints were enough to control the temperature of the film within the camera. Also, the film was not in direct sunlight, so it was never overheated. So basically, they took all these precautions to prevent any of that from happening. They knew how it worked, they knew what was going to happen, and they took all these precautions to keep that from happening. Now, another theory claims that the Apollo 16 crew could not have survived this huge solar flare that was firing out when they were on their way to the moon. Now, the rebuttal of this claim states that there was no solar flare that occurred during the flight of Apollo 16. Now, there were large solar flares that are supposed to have took place in August of 1972. However, this was after Apollo 16 had already returned to Earth and before the Apollo 17 had even left for Earth. So that wouldn't have had anything, when it wasn't going on during the time. Now, another popular conspiracy theory that many people have probably heard about is that the flag that was placed on the surface of the moon by the astronauts fluttered, despite there being no wind on the moon. Now, a lot of people have probably seen that and heard it, a flag cannot flutter in the vacuum of space, So this is claimed to suggest that the landing was filmed on Earth and a breeze or something actually caused it to flutter. Some claim that it was created by indoor fans that were used to help cool the astronauts during the filming, as the spacesuit's cooling systems would have been too heavy to have been used on Earth. Or, you know what I'm saying? So they would have just been like in these suits with no cooling system. Now, this is rebuted by claims that that state the flag was fastened to this rod that's kind of like upside down L. So it's like comes straight up and then it bends over at the top. Yeah. So the top part of the flag was along that, and then the back part of the flag was along that, and then just the bottom part was fluttering. So that was to keep it from hanging down because there was nothing, to hold it up. There was no wind, or whatever to keep it fluttering, so to speak. So the flag only appeared to flutter when the astronauts were moving it into position. Thus, without the air drag, these movements caused the free corner of the flag to swing like a pendulum for some time. They also claimed that the flag rippled because it had been folded during storage and that it was just basically wrinkled. And it just looked like it was rippling when it wasn't actually moving.
Yeah.
It was just wadded up, kind of folded up during storage, and, that's what happened. So the next theory claims that the footprints left behind by the astronauts remain unexpectedly well preserved despite the lack of moisture on the moon. So they're saying because there's no moisture, these should have went away. Now, this is refuted by claims that state that moon dust has not been weathered like the sand on Earth, and it also has these sharp edges. Thus, it allows the dust particles to stick together and hold their shape. The astronauts likened it to being something like talcum powder or kind of like wet sand when you gripped it, so it would hold together.
Right.
So, another theory claims that the supposed moon landings used either a sound stage or they were filmed outside in this remote desert with astronauts either using harnesses or slow motion photography to give the appearance that they were moving more slowly and on the moon. Now, this was rebutted from the HBO miniseries From Earth to the Moon, in which a soundstage and harness setup was used, and during the filming it showed that when the dust rose, it did not settle quickly. Some dust even briefly formed clouds. Now, in the film footage from the Apollo mission, dust kicked up by the astronauts and the lunar roving vehicles rose quite high due to the low lunar gravity, and it settled quickly to the ground in this uninterrupted parabolic arc since there was no air to keep it suspended. And even if there had been a soundstage used where all the air had been pumped out, the dust would have reached nowhere near the height and trajectory as in the Apollo's footage due to Earth's greater gravity. Also, during the Apollo 15 mission, David Scott experimented by dropping a hammer and a falcon feather at the same time, and both items fell at the same rate of speed, which would have proved he was in a vacuum. Furthermore, if the filming was done outside in a desert, there should have been waves present in the mission videos, like heat waves, on the video. And no such heat waves exist in the footage. Also, if the filming had been done on a soundstage, there would have been several anomalies that would have occurred. This would have included things like an increase and decrease in the size of the backdrop if the camera was moved. Also, footage was filmed while the rover was in motion, yet no evidence is present of any change in the size of the background. So, take that with what you want to believe. Next, we're going to discuss mechanical issues that were theorized to be a reason why it was faked. So the first theory claims that the lunar modules made no blast craters and left no sign of dust scatter. Now, rebuttals state that no crater should have been expected, as the thrust was throttled down very far during the final landing. This would mean that the lunar module was no longer quickly decelerating, so the descent engine had only to support the lander's own weight, which had lessened greatly by the moon's gravity and by the near exhaustion of the descent propellants. The next theory claims that the second stage of the launch of the lunar module ascent stage, or both, made no visible flame. So when it took off, there was no flame, so it didn't take off. Now, this is refuted by statements that claim that the lunar module used this Aerozine 50 as fuel and dinitrogen tetroxide as propellants, which were chosen for their simplicity and reliability. And also, they ignite on contact, so they don't require a spark. They just touch each other and poof, And also, they produce a nearly transparent exhaust, so there's you can't really see it. It's just clear looking. Another theory states that the lunar module weighed approximately 17 tons. However, they left no mark on the moon dust despite footprints being able to be seen beside them. Now, this is disputed by claims that state that on the surface of the moon, the lander would have been much lighter than that on Earth, of course, as well. And also, the boots of the astronaut were much smaller than the lander's foot pads, and it was basically a pressure or force per unit that kind of made it depress, and the other, it was like it's sitting on the surface and it didn't really settle in. It was kind of the weight was distributed differently, basically.
Yeah.
It's what it says. The next theory claims that the air conditioning units that were part of the astronaut spacesuits could not have worked in an environment with no atmosphere. And really, that one wasn't really rebuted, but there were some rebuttals about it, but not, big ones. So the next theories revolve around the transmission set back from the mission back to Earth. Now, the first theory claimed that there should have been more than a 2-second delay in communications between the Earth and the Moon. However, this is rebutted by statements that claim that the round-trip light travel time of more than 2 seconds is apparent in all the real-time recordings of the lunar audio. But this is not always pure as expected. There may also be some documentary films out there where the delay has been edited out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
it'd be boring to sit there, them
It would
saying
be.
something, and then it's like 10 seconds, and then you hear them reply back. The next theory claims that the typical delays were only 0.5 seconds. Now, these claims have been disputed as being just flat out untrue. Also, every response would not have been shown as delay, as the replies that were being made by mission control would have essentially been in real time. So basically, they would hear them say something, and they would just reply, and that would be just instant. There would be no delay because it was just transmitting on Earth, in other words. And each of these responses were made as soon as they received a transmission from the moon. So basically, they're on the moon. It takes 5 seconds for it to get here. So once they hear it, they just respond, and we're already on Earth, so it's in real time. The next theory claims that the Parkes Observatory in Australia was built for weeks to be the site that would be relaying communications from the first moon landing. However, only 5 hours before transmissions began, they were told to stand down. Now, this is the theory. Now, the rebuttal for this states that the timing of the first moonwalk was changed after the landing. Also, delays in getting the moonwalk started mean that Parkes covered almost the entire Apollo 11 moonwalk. Next, it was claimed that Parkes supposedly had the clearest video feed from the moon, but the Australian media and all of the known sources ran a live feed from the U.S. Now, it's claimed that the Australian broadcast mission took the transmission directly from the Parkes and Honeysuckle Creek radio telescopes, and then they were then converted to NTSC television at Paddington in Sydney, and this meant that the Australian viewers were actually seeing the moonwalk several seconds before the rest of the world because they were the first ones to get the signal. So that's going to wrap up section 1. And it's got some doozies. Now, there's still some more to talk about. We're going to continue on. The gentleman's going to take over next week, or on our next episode, rather, and he's going to continue on giving you some more of the theories that this was faked. We hope you enjoyed the first segment. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to stay disturbed.